Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Balie, and welcome to this evening on Bleibefreiheit, the freedom to stay, a book by the German critical theorist and eco-feminist Eva von Redecker. My name is Veronica Baas, and tonight I will be hosting this conversation on freedom and on how Eva proposes that we should understand freedom. Because Eva von Redecker tries to persuade us to think differently about freedom, differently than we in the West are used to. And her proposal is radical, and at the same time it's steeped in various fields, in obviously the philosophical fields, but also in biology and geology, and most of all in feminist and ecological traditions. And tonight we are very honored to have Eva von Redecker here herself to talk about her book, but also various other thinkers. I'm really happy they could all join, and they are looking from this concept from their various fields, which we have 3 lawyers and two social historians and another philosopher. So I think we can really try to think about this concept, this new way to think about freedom. So I hope we will be able to think out loud together tonight. But first I'd like to ask Ingrid Leijten to introduce this book and this evening. And she's a professor of Dutch and International Constitutional Law at Tilburg University. And she's also the reason Eva von Redecker is here tonight. Ingrid, you're behind me, but can you please introduce us?
An hour ago. And of course, for those of you who have been able to read the book, you also know why this is, right? The book has a very personal style, and it starts out with your experience of freedom when, during the pandemic, a trip to the US, where you had to hold several lectures, was cancelled, and all of a sudden you ended up with an empty calendar and with freedom. But it's not only the book, and I will use these introductory minutes to also say a little bit about how I got to know you and your work, but also how it relates to my thinking. And I'm not a philosopher, I sometimes wish I were. I'm a constitutional law scholar, a topic that is actually more popular at the moment than it probably should be. And I guess I'm also the reason why there's so many lawyers at the table tonight. I'm sorry for that. I work on the rule of law, on fundamental rights. And I think that also in these fields, it is extremely important that we critically engage with concepts such as freedom, because they underpin what we do and they underpin what we think law is and should be. And especially indeed in these times in which political developments are worrisome and they're not about to go away. So back to the summer of 2023, I was on vacation with my German-Dutch family, listening to some podcasts. I often listen to podcasts to get away from the busy family life. You probably recognize that. And I ended up listening to a podcast with you. I think it was about I don't know. I in the end ended up listening to a lot of podcasts. And I decided to immediately get the book on my e-reader, and I tremendously enjoyed reading it that summer. So Eva is making the case for a different way to look at freedom. We usually understand freedom as individual freedom, as freedom of movement, which means we're constantly demarcating spaces, boundaries more generally. My freedom starts where yours end, and vice versa. Instead, she argues in favor of the freedom to stay, but actually in favor of the freedom in time, as time, which can be understood, and I practiced this as eine Fülle erfüllte Zeit in eine Zeit der Fülle. So it's a long and healthy life, but also a meaningful life, a life that is not linear, but that is constantly interrupted by new beginnings, by creative processes. And that takes place in a full world. Now, I've for a long time been a fan of the work of Hannah Arendt and of the vita activa, the idea of acting in a public space in a world that allows for pluralism. At the same time, I've always also been a little bit frustrated, I guess, by this other side of the animal laborans, the one that has these cyclical, repetitive jobs, household tasks, that take up a lot of time and that don't really seem to change much in the world. Now, I think one of the beautiful things that struck me personally, indeed, is how Eva connects the idea of acting, of beginning in the world, with making sure that there is a world to do this in the first place. And that requires cycles, regeneration, it requires care as a precondition also. So I wrote her a message that summer on Instagram asking perhaps there is also a English version coming that I can recommend to colleagues or to friends who maybe shy away from German philosophy in German. And mostly you should probably, but in this case it wasn't that necessary. However, you told me, no, there's not immediately an English version coming, but a Dutch version. And then we agreed that if that book would be there, we would try to organize something. And I'm very happy and thankful that the Balie was able to pick up on this idea and that we have this great lineup tonight. Because indeed, the idea of Bleibefreiheit, the freedom to stay, brings up a lot of questions. So how did we end up with this individualistic way of looking at kind of a spatial understanding of freedom in the first place? What does it mean, Bleibefreiheit, for our relations and for the divide between the public and the private domain? What does it mean for migration? And last but not least, for climate change? I wrote you and said that the book would make a lasting impact on my life and my work. That's how I started my message. So what about the work part? And I want to end this introduction by making two, more or less, remarks related indeed to fundamental rights and to the rule of law. So when it comes to fundamental rights, indeed in the world of law, in the world of constitutional law, fundamental rights are more or less, embodied freedom. And originally, indeed, we were thinking of fundamental rights as a space that is safe from interference by the state. But of course, meanwhile, we have a lot of fundamental rights, and there's also the realization that these rights are not absolutes. But when it comes to courts, in the end, balancing individual rights versus more general interests, they do also judge on this balance at a particular moment in time. And you also mentioned that, for example, the German Bundesverfassungsgericht has been able in a judgment to also include the interests of future generations as a way of, remodeling fundamental rights to the challenges that we are facing. But I think rightly so, you also note that the freedom of these future generations that should be protected and that should be taken on board in the political process is again quite an individual kind of freedom of movement. Germans driving 160 on the Autobahn also still in the times to come. So I started thinking also about fundamental rights not as trumps, that the Trump state interference, or as principles that courts have to balance, but also as rooms. And I'm sorry, this is kind of a spatial understanding again, but I think that if we want to make Bleibefreiheit, the freedom to stay, freedom in time, real in the world of fundamental rights, we must also shift our focus from individual freedoms to more social rights and to the political spaces where all these conflicting rights are given shape. Because indeed we have rights to health, we have rights to a clean environment. I guess Laura might say something more on that later. But the question is, what is happening in this room? The rights that are our rooms that we need to renovate, that we need to pay attention to, means that there is a durable and a solid structure, but at the same time, there is movement within that room. And it matters who is the room, who is in that room, which interests are there, and how do these interests interact. So I think also these questions are important for when we look at the future of fundamental rights. And that brings me to the final point, the rule of law. Well, as probably all of you know, we have been occupied over the past weeks and months with a new government that not only uses crisis rhetoric, but also wants to take emergency measures as a way of setting aside migration law and taking concrete policy measures that indeed are in violation of human rights and other higher laws. And of course, the law allows for this exception, but only in case there's a vital interest of the state at stake and when the normal legislative route of changing the law is not available, mainly because there's simply no time to do so. It is clear, we all agree, that's not the kind of situation we're facing. And I've been asked a number of times to explain what's the problem, and I heard myself saying on the radio and elsewhere that this is how the system works and you should play according to the rules, and we have these checks and balances and it's important to keep them alive and understand what they're for. But somehow it didn't always resonate enough with my audience until I realized it is also in the end, I think, about freedom. It is a freedom that is different from allowing a strong leader to take the measures he or she says majorities want, or the strong leader that probably does not take measures that can be painful, but would allow our freedom in a more durable and future-proof sense. It is in the end, I think also there, the freedom of the space where rights and politics come together. And that is, I believe, also why we should be, particularly at this time, very mindful of what freedom is and question this concept. So I'm very happy to have you all here, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ingrid Leijten. I am joined here at the table by Heidi de Rudy, philosopher, by Annelien de Dijn, professor of modern political history, and by Eva von Redecker. I think this is the third introduction, but critical theorist and feminist philosopher, writing about social change, moral judgment, modern property for a long time in an academic setting, and now also writing non-fiction for the general audience here present. Although I wouldn't call Ingrid the general audience, perhaps. Fundamental rights in the Constitution, is that a link that is often made with your work?
Well, actually, only once before by a human rights organization in Berlin, but I think it's very useful because it's a link that shamefully I do very little because I'm so ignorant. I'm not even a philosopher of law, let alone a lawyer. But I think, I can say a few things about why I think we need to rethink this order of freedom based in fundamental rights that are understood as something that is somewhat analog to property, and that are understood, as I say, in a spatial way. And, in a way, what I do is it's so predictable. Every critical theorist criticizes the notion of freedom that we have, right? And the only thing that is a bit different with me is that I think, in a way, we don't even need to criticize the liberal notion of freedom very much at the moment because it's breaking in front of our eyes, and it's breaking into something partly worse and more toxic than it ever was, but also sort of displaying some of the underside that it had all along. And secondly, that I think some of the very good answers we have also in social philosophy and feminist philosophy to think freedom more collectively or more socially still have no way to think of nature and the environment other than an external kind of condition for our freedom. But it's not sort of the sphere within which we can realize our freedom. And maybe it sounds weird to you that I even say we think of freedom in a spatial way, but I think, so if you talk to general audience, it's very much about, the first thing that comes to mind is like, I can go wherever I want. And obviously that's not all there is to our notion of freedom, but even the more sophisticated notions, so something like autonomy, where you say, there is a sphere within which my will, which I control, can move unrestrained, is a spatial image. You think about what leeway is there now? And that totally doesn't take into account what comes after and how it goes on and how our freedom will kind of stretch through time. And also, this model has some resonances of like suggesting in a way quite a colonial, quite a kind of arbitrary relation to space, like you should always have more. And, you know, to me, it's so weird that we use those concepts that were invented, most of them in early modern political theory, at a time when the thinkers had beliefs about what the Earth or the actual space they were in was, that was so different from ours, right? I mean, Locke, he thought the Earth was 6,000 years old and that there was abundant, infinite space, and the more you work on it, the more fertile and productive it gets. I mean, this is not the planet we inhabit. We live on a different planet, and our political concepts need to reflect that. And the world we do live in is one in which the habitable zones shrink. Like, even if we dealt well with climate change, which we're not, already it's clear that there will be less space where people can stay. And then this sort of trend, which is in itself man-made, is sort of overtaken by much more immediate man-made catastrophes. I mean, we're witnessing new atrocities and warfare, ethnic cleansing in the Middle East. We are also having a new discourse, definitely in my country, not just about stopping migration, but about remigration, like deporting immigrants. So there's all sort of this idea of using the space in order to kind of destroy freedoms of other people and making them not able to stay. And I think there would be a way to sort of stick to the spatial liberal imaginary and say, yes, that's exactly what, if we want to be just, we need to make space for everyone to stay, you know, that's what we need to do. And I would agree with that, and that would be something that I think human rights and fundamental rights should be there for, to enable that. But if we stay in that imaginary, then I think we lose something that is very crucial to motivate us to seek freedom, and that is something like, you know, the infinity that you have in this idea of movement, and also something like the sort of abundance that is promised to you. Pierre Charbonnier, whom I admire a lot, says we need to just decouple freedom from abundance, but I don't think that's right. We just need to find the right type of abundance, and I think the right type of abundance is something that is much more found in a very rich and lively world. And in order to, and that's why what motivates me to sort of suggest that we switch dimension, and instead of being like, okay, how much space is there, where can I go, to be like, how much time do I have? What does it even mean to have time? What does time need to look like so that I'm free? Obviously, just having time is not enough, so it needs to be kind of safe, linear time. It also needs to be, as Ingrid said, this time of beginning, and then suddenly you have the infinity back, because there are infinite, if you're free, if nobody else owns your time, there are infinite possibilities of what you could do. It's sort of that potentiality opens up time again. But yeah, you can only do that if you're not too tired and if the world hasn't broken down. And that's this sort of cyclical time of recovery or regeneration that is also needed. And I do think for human animals to be free, those three things have to come together. And if you think about it that way, then at least it's actually, I think you're doing me too much honor. It isn't even a decent collective notion of freedom yet, but it's a way of thinking about individual freedom that doesn't pit individual freedoms against each other from the start, but that sort of allows to see that, you know, the more life there is around me, the more lively and the more options do I have. And also, since I think over time, then the other could also be somebody who collaborates with me. And then my freedom will grow from having that, opponent or that other. So those were kind of the ideas that made me toy with this idea of be like, okay, so why don't we turn it around? Why don't we have Bleibefreiheit rather than Bewegungsfreiheit?
Yeah. So before we go into the Bleibefreiheit a little bit more, I wanted to go back a little bit about, you just said that we need to think about who shaped the concepts that shaped the way we think about freedom right now. And that is also, Annelien, I think, very close to what your book, Freedom, An Unruly History, is about. So you're mentioning these early modern philosophers and how they think about freedom. How political has the process of determining what freedom means been? Has that been political all along?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what you see... Sure.
Yes.
Is this better?
Yes.
What you see on the one hand is that freedom is a high-minded philosophical ideal, and philosophers have been sort of wrestling what it means to be free and whether we can be free at all and why freedom would be valuable for centuries. So, and I think Eva's book is in a long line, but an amazing contribution to that tradition. But what I've been more interested in my work is the way in which freedom has been used as a political slogan, to sort of, as a weapon, right? To claim that what you're defending is good and what others are doing is bad. And you see that also has a very long tradition. If you look at the ancient Greeks, they were already saying, the Greeks were already saying to the Persians, well, you guys are all slaves, not in the sense of being held as chattel slaves, but because the Persians in the Greek imaginary, which isn't entirely true, but that's beside the point, believed that Persians were kowtowing towards this absolute monarch, the great king, and they, by contrast, they themselves only obeyed themselves because they were self-ruling, and that's why they were free. Also in intra-Greek battles, for instance, the Athenians and the Spartans, when they got embroiled in war, would claim, well, we are fighting for freedom, we are the true freedom fighters. And so that has a long tradition in and of itself. But what you see is that in the way we now think about freedom is very different from this ancient Greek way of thinking about freedom. When we now think about freedom, we tend to think of it as not something to do with self-government or with democracy, first and foremost at least, but we tend to think of it as being about being left alone as much as possible by our government, right? Having a state that is as minimal as possible, that interferes as little as possible with our lives. And that way of thinking is also primarily a product of political struggles that go back to the early 19th century. So that's when that particular conception of freedom was invented, as I try to show in my book. And it became really dominant after World War II, also through historically contingent factors.
Yeah. In a way, when I also listen to what you just, it's also a bit lazy, right? To stop thinking about what it means to be free once you've put the government aside and not to fill it in.
Yes, and what we see right now is that it's actually filled in by right-wing or even fascist forces, and also in a kind of anti-government way, but in one that paradoxically brings in way more authoritarian government.
Yeah. Well, that is something that I have observed as well. It seems so. The way we think about freedom, a very sort of simple way of explaining how we came to think of it, it's of freedom in this sort of very minimalistic way, is that this is related to the triumph of what we usually call neoliberalism in the 1980s and 1990s. And that is how we end up with this sort of poor conception of freedom that seems to be dominant today. And sort of, I always thought that this conception of freedom was especially dominant in the United States, but during the corona epidemic, it struck me that it was actually alive and kicking, or it seemed to be in Europe as well, right? Lots of measures that were being taken during the coronavirus epidemic. They sparked huge protests by people who felt that these measures were limiting their freedom, and this was this horrible thing. But I do wonder. So I feel like the political debate about freedom is shifting a little bit, in the sense that it seems to me that there's actually a little bit less of an embrace of freedom as this unifying value, and it seems to me, at least, that on the right, at least, we see the emergence of a new, much more patriarchal right wing, but in the sort of alt-right, and that there seems to be less of an emphasis and less of an embrace of this concept of freedom. But yeah, obviously that's still early days, but you see that very clearly in relation to the American elections, where somebody like the Republican Party, traditionally the party that's always emphasizing they're the party of freedom, but Trump doesn't really do that as much. He does it occasionally, but it's really striking to me that he talks a lot less about, which is actually scary.
Yeah.
One day, maybe we'll regret the demise of neoliberalism as having made way for something even more unpalatable. At least, you can talk about an impoverished version of freedom, but outright authoritarianism is even more scary, you might say.
Yeah.
Can I say one thing to that?
Yeah, definitely.
I think that's a good observation, but I wonder whether there isn't. I think the notion of freedom that we have, if one takes very seriously the fact that it comes with this idea of ownership, or it's kind of built on that idea of owning something and owning it in the modern sense, which means you can totally control it, even destroy and abuse it. If this wild sovereignty is part of the concept of freedom, then I think that is a hinge where the talk of freedom as being free from interference sort of tips into freedom as sort of tyranny and domination, because you can't just be free from something. I think this negative freedom also always needs a positive arena in which it experiences itself. And that, I mean, for especially then for white men that have been racialized, others and women and their reproductive work, and there have been outer spheres all along in the history of modernity that were taken as a test for the freedom of those who were possessive individuals. And I think, so that's one way in which it sort of tips, but I do actually think that, I mean, that was kind of the Trump of like the locker room talk and the groping, and now we have the Trump of the defending whatever your arena of freedom is, you're the nation or like patriots from the alien enemies. And then it's really like freedom is just crushing the enemy, and that's sort of it's in the full self-defense mode. So maybe it's just the dark shadow of freedom and not freedom anymore or something.
Yeah. Heidi, you're also a philosopher. Why is it so important to keep thinking of what the concept of freedom means?
Because it actually means something to our lives, really in the concrete. I just have to come back to what is said until now. I want to react on that. It's very interesting to listen to that, especially for somebody with my background. I come from Persia. I'm half German, half Persian. I have been a refugee. So the freedom, the negative freedom of movement was very important to me. I am a migrant now here, so what you coin the Bleibefreiheit, the freedom to stay, is very important as well. Yeah. And it's also important for Palestinian people, I guess, at this very moment. Yeah. To be able to stay at home.
Yeah.
Then I've read your book, of course. We have this notion of positive freedom. My interpretation is that you have the possibility to lead the life the way you want to. Do I want to be a mother or not as a woman? Do I, whatever, so that I'm not forced to be a mother, for example. All these things, for me, have huge validity in terms of thinking about freedom. They are very legitimate and necessary. But for me, thinking about freedom is much bigger, and I do understand your motivation that you have, why you've written the book, and I totally share it. Everything that is happening right now, we are talking also about the reactionary movement into fascism, I dare say, and the sort of regressing into even patriarchal modes of being and taking away freedom from large populations. But freedom, and you say it needs to move from spatial to temporal. Honestly, for me as a philosopher, freedom already is temporal, because freedom means the possibility. Freedom means openness. Freedom also on itself is infinity. So freedom already always is future. It's already temporal in the future sense, and I'm sure you agree with me as a philosopher. So it's good to think maybe about freedom, to position it opposite of, so possibility, to position it opposite of reality. Reality is already always past tense. We are living in the now, but the now we are living in is already past tense. The way the world is shaped and why it's shaped the way it is because before us, people have taken decisions collectively, politically, to have this world that we have. We have these things, neoliberalism, which is another word for capitalism, and they have co-opted the word liberal, which means freedom. And they have shaped this whole capitalist way of living and this notion of infinite growth, which is totally absurd in a finite world. So I'm thinking in opposites. So we have reality and we have possibility. It's already always future and possibility is something that is contingent. It doesn't necessarily need to become reality, right? So what I want to propose, and I saw somebody with whom I've studied philosophy in the audience, and it must be very recognizable for them. What I want to propose is to really think about the difference between finitude, that you are also mentioning in your book, our mortality, but finitude of the human being is not only mortality, it's also your origins, in what kind of community were you born into, what kind of conventions are there. In Iran right now, the convention is that women are not allowed to walk around as they want to. So we have this freedom on its own is infinity, it's limitless, but we are finite. So we have a tension between our finitude and the infinity of possibility. How can a human being then participate in this enormous, infinite freedom? That's quite difficult, but I suggest it's not, and I think there also we somehow meet, Eva, you and I. So what I think can connect the human finitude to the infinity of freedom is transcendence. And what exactly do I mean? Transcendence, I really mean something like a transcendent norm, normativity, morality, which is different than legality, but both are necessary. So a transcendent norm that sort of bridges these two spheres of finitude and infinity. And what kind, to make it a little bit more concrete, what kind of a norm could we think of? I call this bounded freedom, so it's not this totally limitless freedom. That's not reachable for us human beings, but bounded freedom, bounded by a transcendent normative norm, which not only links these two spheres, but also it's something that you orientate yourself towards before you act, when you still think before you judge, when you still think. In the sense of climate change, I'm a big climate change activist. In the sense of climate change, I'm thinking of a normativity like the duty of care for the earth. I make also a difference between the world and the earth, by the way. The duty of care, or Hannah Arendt's plurality, the simple fact that we are plural, that we are all different in this world, and to take this as a normativity. When you do that, this freedom becomes meaningful for our concrete lives. When you don't do that, we go to this really arbitrary, senseless, meaningless form of freedom where anything goes. And when you do that, the only thing that could maybe bound that would be laws, would be legality, but hey, laws are being broken right now. At this very moment, international law is being broken. Or let's go back to, I'm half German, to the Nazis in Germany. They just made laws that you have to kill. It was totally legal, but it was not moral. And that's what I want to suggest. So it is important to have this aspect of normativity, of morality. For us human beings, otherwise we can't take part, we can't participate in freedom. That's what I think.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's amazing. You're definitely right. Of course, philosophers have thought about freedom in temporal ways, and I think because you're also an Arendtian, right? Then Arendt, of course, does, and I think Beauvoir to some extent does as well. So and I want to say one thing about that when you said that it should be in a way more practical or have more to do with reality, and I found that really interesting in writing also how to keep it abstract enough that it's actually not just my opinion and experience, but that even my enemies could argue with that term, but still give it a kind of shape. And then one way in which I thought I could give it this sort of that temporality a shape was to think about the extreme points of our life and time that we share. So we know we're mortal, and you said with the finitude, and that also could be translated to lots of other finitudes where I can't, think of everything I ever read, and that's such a shame because then I could answer better, whatever finitude. And then the other thing, which is Arendt's point, like we're also born, and that makes us infinite in a new way. And then the third thing I wanted to be able to think is, in a way, something like the time of the world. And I find it so interesting that you then add the morality, which I'm probably guilty of not talking much about. But to me, so I think your suggestion is different because you also talk about environmental ethics, but the way then I was taught it in my studies is like, Kant says, how do I reconcile necessity and freedom by the moral law within me? And then he always has this line where it's and the firmament, the sky with the stars above me. And in a way, what I try in the last chapter is to say, okay, how can it be more like the impulse to care and the soil beneath my feet, or the earth, and because in critical theory, it's quite amazing that I suddenly talk like a Hegelian. People who know me know that I usually don't. In critical theory, what we seek is immanent transcendence. So it's not this sort of eternal moral law, but there's this idea that it needs to be already somewhere in the world, and then there are different ways of talking. It could be the solidarity that we share or something. Hegel obviously thought it was the core institutions of his Prussian society. But I'm in the last chapter trying to find something like transcendence in this idea of nature as like a like endless number of intertwined cycles of regeneration. And that indeed has the problem that you don't get to morality from there. Like you get to sort of a balance, but...
You could. I want to suggest
very
you
generous.
could. So also very concretely, I know, I mean, I'm a metaphysician, so that you really immanent transcendence doesn't exist for me. It bites each other, right?
Yeah,
but what I want to suggest, transcendence, you can also think of, if we take temporality, we have the past tense. That's the reality. We have the now and we have the future, right? The now basically is also past tense as I see it, because this table has been built I don't know how many times ago, and it has been brought here, and before we were here right now talking, we had to sit, so it's past tense. We are living basically in the past. But in the now, what we can do in the now, and that's how I understand Hannah Arendt's natality. It's not so much that we are reborn, but that we have the possibility to begin something completely new.
Of course, yeah.
Which will have implications for, I don't know when, maybe in short term, but also long term, mostly long term. So what I want to suggest is if we take this bounded freedom, bounded by normativity, we have, in regards to the past, we have an accountability to take on.
Okay.
Like, I'm sure you know Walter Benjamin, that the victims of the past still need to be redeemed. We still have to make sure that what they had to go through doesn't happen again, right? So there's this accountability, and there's this transcendence then to the past that informs your decision and your action now. And then you have the transcendence from the future. This norm can motivate you, it can inspire you. But it also lets you know, okay, maybe if we do something now really radical to change climate change, to stop it now, to really stop fossil fuels, we are giving back future to generations we will not even get to know because we will be dead by then. So there's this transcendence on that part as well. That's what I mean with transcendence, and not so much immanence, but really still transcendence.
If you say the past is here, then maybe it is imminent.
No, it was not.
Yeah.
It was not pre. Yeah.
Okay. If you want to respond briefly or not, because I think
I want to respond lengthily, and we do that later.
That's what philosophers do, right?
Definitely. Yeah. But I also want to make room to listen to. We've become pretty abstract. So I've asked Lineke Slingeberg, who is a professor of migrants and the rule of law, to look at Eva's concept of freedom to stay and to imagine what that concretely would mean for migrants. And I think we can then respond to that afterwards. So I would ask her to...
Yes, thank you. So, like Ingrid, I'm not a philosopher. I'm a legal scholar, so my contribution will be quite different from this fascinating conversation that you're having, and that I actually feel sorry to interrupt. But I want to look at how this concept of Bleibefreiheit relates to my field of work, so migration law. So imagine being a Syrian national forced to flee your country due to war. After a long and dangerous journey, you end up in the Netherlands, where you apply for asylum. You have to wait for more than a year until you receive a decision on your application. During this time, you're moved between 4 different emergency shelters. For the first 6 months, you're not allowed to work. And after that, you're restricted to just 24 weeks a year. Even after finally receiving a residence permit, you face uncertainty. The residence permit can be revoked if the situation in Syria improves, or if you commit any criminal offenses. Meanwhile, your spouse and children remain in Syria, living in constant danger. You can only apply for family reunification once your asylum application is approved. But even then, it takes more than 18 months for the immigration service to begin processing your request. While this situation may seem unjust or unfair, it is actually hard to criticize this situation from a purely legal perspective. This kind of wasted time and these forms of temporal harms, as my colleague Martijn Strongs calls it, are not in clear violation of human rights, for example. And it is for these reasons that I believe that Eva's concept of Bleibefreiheit is very relevant for the field of migration law. Firstly, because of her idea that freedom of movement, one of the central concepts in migration law, presupposes the freedom to stay. Not in the sense that you have the freedom to stay where you are, but that you have the freedom to stay somewhere. There must always be a place where it is possible to stay. So thinking about the freedom to stay in temporal terms, as Eva does, requires continuation, an opportunity to start over and build a future. And if we were to make that kind of freedom more central to migration law, that would have important consequences. For example, because in migration law, the residence of refugees in a host country is inherently temporary. It is a core principle of international refugee law that as soon as the situation in the country of origin improves, a refugee's right to remain in the host country may be revoked. This is particularly evident in the temporary protection regime for Ukrainians, which automatically ends after 3 years. So accordingly, the recent proposals by the new Dutch government to abolish the permanent residence permit for refugees does not encounter any major legal problems. But from this perspective of the freedom to stay, this is highly problematic. Based on this concept of freedom, if you can no longer stay where you live due to war, ecological disasters, poverty, then you should have the opportunity to settle elsewhere, not just to be provided with temporary protection. So Bleibefreiheit could prompt us to critically evaluate these key elements of migration law. And a second reason why Eva's concept of Bleibefreiheit is relevant to migration law is because it emphasizes the significance of fulfilled time. So in addition to focusing on continuity, she highlights the quality of time, in my words. So what matters, Eva writes, is that we like the way our time is organized. It's about having the freedom to build meaningful relationships, making life fuller, time more satisfying. And crucially, this kind of freedom only exists when we are not dominated by others. In an interview, Eva said, "Fulfilled time is the negation of dominion." And that resonates with my own work on the Republican concept of freedom as non-domination. The freedom not to be dependent on someone who can exercise unconstrained power over you. So to be free from this kind of power is, as I read it, essential for achieving a sense of fulfilled time. Yet, asylum seekers and refugees are often subjected to state domination. They are entirely dependent on the state for crucial aspects of their lives, and this power of the state is hardly constrained by law. Asylum seekers are, for example, subjected to strict rules of conduct in reception centers, have to report to the authorities on a daily or weekly basis, are required to perform cleaning duties, and face frequent forced transfers with little notice. My research reveals that, again, human rights offers only very limited protection against these practices. While the importance of fulfilled time, as conceptualized by Eva, provides an additional and more positively formulated argument for demonstrating the problematic nature of this kind of practices. So I believe, and this links to what, perhaps to what Heidi said, so I believe that these kind of philosophical concepts, such as Bleibefreiheit, can function as a relevant external framework of assessment for critically evaluating the law. And it could inform new interpretations of the law being an argumentative discipline. So I would like to thank you for providing us with this concept, for highlighting the fundamental importance of being able to stay somewhere. And it made me think of the poem Ziehende Landschaft of the German poet Hilde Domin. And so to conclude this little intermezzo, I read the English translation by Michel Mendelssohn. Moving landscape. One has to be able to leave, yet still remain like a tree, as if we were rooted to the ground, as if things moved past us, yet we stood still. One has to hold one's breath until the wind dies down and the unfamiliar air encircles us, until the play of light and shadow, of green and blue, reveals familiar patterns, and we are at home, wherever that may be, and we may sit down and rest as if leaning on our mother's grave. Thank you.
Would you like to respond?
Well, yeah, thank you so much. This is actually really interesting for me to think about as well. I mean, you know, this is in some sense a very generous interpretation you're giving, because of course on the surface there's something quite unsettling about me always talking about the freedom to stay, because, you know, it's like, what does if I mean people should stay where they are, and I think it was worth sort of taking that risk, because I do think that the freedom to move and the freedom to stay are both sort of necessarily referring to the other. So obviously, if I say the freedom to stay, you need to be able to leave. Otherwise, it's a coercion to stay, right? It's kind of the test. And the same for freedom to move. If you kind of flesh that out very beautifully, but horrifyingly also with the migration law. If you can move but not arrive, then this freedom to move isn't any good. And I mean, there is this dystopia of like a world sort of in climate disaster where there's sort of no place anymore to arrive. It's obviously this like horrors of the people in Gaza being always told like, oh, go somewhere else, it's safe there. I mean, it's crazy. But and actually, Hannah Arendt has it also talking about the international refugee conventions of her time, where there's actually a line in Elements and Origins of Totalitarianism where she says the freedom to move without the right to arrive somewhere sounds very much like the freedom of hares in hunting season. And I think, I mean, the way in which we have in the Anthropocene made hunting season a permanent feature of our biosphere was also like obviously unthought of by Arendt. So I think the freedom to stay, of course, requires the ability to move, but it sort of turns around where the stress of the freedom lies. And I mean, obviously it doesn't work that way, but I sometimes think there's something so wrong about white Europeans with passports like me get to sort of say, oh yes, I grant the freedom to move to somebody. I mean, you said who comes from a civil war in Syria. I mean, what? No, like I'm really lucky for no like achievement of mine. I have freedom to stay relatively. I mean, it can always be freer, but I have this kind of fundamental freedom to stay. So if some other people don't, then it's the least that I kind of assist their kind of freedom to stay elsewhere and sort of make space for it. So it kind of switches around where this kind of generosity lies somehow, and that would be maybe one added thing that I have on my mind on how this might relate to the migration debate. I mean, yeah. Not that it will have any effect, but I mean, I just to think it through.
Yeah. Well, you say not that it might have any effect, but you're quite ambitious in trying to change how we think about freedom. And I think also Annelien's work really shows that it really does shape the world and politics, how we think about freedom, right? So can you tell us a little bit about who decides how we think about freedom and what has worked in the past? Like why were some people successful in defining how we think about freedom and others not?
That's a really great question. And
what should Eva do?
It's nothing that philosophers can do. It's not.
Yeah, actually, I think, Eva, we shouldn't downplay the role of philosophers. I know philosophers like to think of themselves as people with not that much agency, and of course that's to a large extent true. But ideas do have power. As a historian of ideas, that is one of the few things I'm convinced of. But on the other hand, whether certain ideas, find a favorable reception or not, also has a lot to do with the institutional and political context. So one of the reasons why sort of the neoliberal conception of freedom became so dominant after World War II has a lot to do with the international context of the Cold War, which made it very dangerous if you were on the left in Europe to claim that your project had any emancipatory ambition. Because to make those claims was to actually say you were sympathetic to Marxism and its emancipatory vision right? So the idea you need sort of a communist state in order to be truly free, and you need to destroy capitalism in order to be truly free. That's a key idea of Marx, who's not a thinker of equality, but a thinker of freedom. But anyway, because of that political and international context, it became very easy to, if you were on the left and you used concepts like freedom, high-flying, high-mind concept, that came to seem suspect, and that is why freedom became sort of monopolized by the right and by people who wanted to link it to just having this minimal power. But to link this to what we just heard about migration law, there's something really interesting that I think Ingrid said, and that Lineke also sort of mentioned, which is that what is really striking to me, if you look at the debate about migration and the so-called asylum crisis today, it's really striking to me that that debate is being conducted right now in terms of the rule of law, right? These are bad ideas because they violate the rule of law. And I think that's a really weak argument, because in the end of the day, what is the rule of law, right? It's laws can change, hence what affects the rule of law can also change. So I really want to subscribe to Lineke's call that we should start talking more about the values that we want to defend when we're talking about things like asylum seekers and the treatment of migrants in this country. Yeah. So I'm not. Yeah. In addition to, I think. Thinking of this more in terms of how migrants' freedom is violated, I think that's a good start. But the more general point I want to make is we should put these normative principles more up and center, and not just talk about this in these technical terms of laws that are being violated or international treaties that are being violated. I mean, that is also not a good thing, but I think it would be strategically better to be more upfront about the normative principles that we feel are being violated.
Yes.
There we go, normativity.
Yes, but I also would again say the philosophical articulation actually comes after certain struggles in the world have already kind of, used a concept. And in some sense, I mean, I know very well why I think of freedom to stay as very precious, because I mean, I hate traveling and I'm just weird. Like, that wouldn't mean that's me, so nobody else should care. Mm-hmm. But then when you look at how a lot of current struggles are conducted, this term of staying comes up again and again. So at least in the German context, so the refugee movement has a big right to stay, and we all want to stay. No human is illegal, of course, as well, but also really this terminology of staying. And the environmental movement is doing all those occupations of forests, and then it's always like this forest stays and this forest stays, and that's kind of the slogan. It's always about something has to stay. And so in some sense, at best, I might have noticed something and picked it up. But what bothered me so much is that it seemed that in the public debate, which in the last 2 years has been quite drastic in how the environmental movement as well has been criminalized. Like, it's really changed the way they were treated in Germany. But that they weren't somehow able to speak back at the approach that they were against freedom. So yeah, you're in order for some forest to stay, but you're against freedom because freedom is the motorway. And that just seemed so absurd to me. Like, in some sense, all I think like a little essay like that can achieve is at least to be like, help make that next step of saying, oh no, we're actually also in favor of freedom. It's just a different freedom, you know? And what do you mean by freedom? And what sense does it make to now build motorways that will melt in 20 years? So I think that's a way in which you can insert your thinking into the kind of struggles that are already there, which also speak like they have words, you know. They don't wait for philosophers to give them a terminology, but yeah, as a philosopher, you can then make more words around that.
Yeah, and I think today is a really opportune moment to do exactly that, to reclaim the concept of freedom by progressives. And why is that the case? Because it's becoming so clear that on the right, the concept of freedom is not just impoverished, but they're also becoming more more open about the authoritarian nature of their ultimate goals. So I think this is a good moment to try to reclaim the concept of freedom for the left.
Great. Then I would like to thank my first panel, two-thirds of my first panel.
Oh, I want to thank the first panel. Amazing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Heidi de Rudy and Annelien de Dijn. And I would like to ask Laura Burgers and Lotte Houwing-ten-Kate to join me here. I'll introduce them. Yeah, I've asked Lotte to sit here because the chair matches her outfit. So Laura Burgers works as an assistant professor at the Amsterdam Center for Private Law, and her research interests include climate change litigation and democratic theory and the rights of future generations and the rights of nature. And Lotte Houwing-ten-Kate is an historian of modern Europe, and she is right now a past and present postdoctoral fellow in London, and her research includes the intellectual and social history of the 20th century, the history of feminism, sexuality, intimacy, and love. And yesterday, her book on the myth of the nuclear family came out. So congratulations with that.
Congratulations. Thank you. I want to be. Can I be invited for a roundtable on that?
You can, actually. So, very roughly speaking, you represent the ecological and the feminist lines of thought in Eva's work. Mm-hmm. So, if I read the book correctly, you are trying to imagine a world in which we are not constantly exploiting ourselves and not constantly exploiting the earth, but rather finding a way to spend our time that regenerates us and that replenishes us and that satisfies us rather than exhausting and exploiting us. So I want to start with the feminist theory. Like, why do you turn to feminist theory when you want to point that out?
Well, because there is no better. I do. So, see, I think that if we talk about emancipation, I think, and you want to have a kind of radical idea of liberation, it has to come from the activity of that is supposed to be liberated itself. It's not just some kind of status that you get from outside. And then we have a long tradition of Marxism working with the workers and productive labor. And one of the crucial achievements of feminist theory in the last 50 years, or 100, depending on where you start, was to bring really into center of attention a different type of labor, reproductive labor, the labor that is sort of care work or addresses needs. And I actually thought, like in my last book, I still kind of blended that into what we need with the environment and kind of just try to extend it. And I think that's not right, because then it's also just us liberating nature. And so the kind of ecofeminist last chapter of the book there, I try to do something to be inspired by this move to reproductive labor by moving to what I call regenerative labor, which is also something that restores life. But it's not labor in the sense it's not intentional. So, you know, if a mother, it's very important also for feminists to fight against, you also brought that up, this stupid, like this very, this idea of care work as being very devoid of freedom and meaning, you know? I mean, actually, that's not the animals we are. There's always freedom. You know, if you breastfeed a baby, you can hold like this or like that, and that's like, there's a choice there. So there is freedom in that activity all the way down, and there's intentionality. But at the same time, there is a labor that just happens in us as well, and so far as we're also part of nature, that is not intentional. You know, we just sort of breathe and digest, and it just happens. And like the trees do their thing, and the soil, the worms, and all the little things do their thing, and it's not labor because they don't have a plan. The earthworm just lives, but by its living, it produces something like in a functioning ecosystem, something that something else lives on. So you have those metabolic cycles, and so. That's what I call regeneration, and in a way that's this attempt to take the feminist thinking about work one step further in that realm of nature.
Yeah, Lotte, so this line of thinking, Eva also refers to Luisa Morano, an Italian feminist. Can you explain a little bit of how radical that was to really try to articulate that kind of way of spending your time as labor?
Well, I mean, it was very radical, maybe in the first sense, of course, because so much of feminism at that time was actually concerned with the right to not have a child, right? So it was this sort of further theorizing of maternal power, right, is the term that you are also using, was incredibly radical at the time. But then I actually also want to challenge it a little bit, yes, because I think that in your reading of feminism, I recognize something which I also feel, which is a kind of nostalgia for this sort of 1970s, 1980s feminism. And I'm all with you, but I think we should maybe also challenge ourselves a little bit in that, because I think, of course, this notion of maternal power, how do we defend that, right, in an economic system in which is sort of based on the exploitation of the mother, still at this moment, but also, and maybe that even sort of takes it further, I might say that the parent-child relationship is the most intimate property relationship that we have. So how much liberation is there to be found in that relationship?
Thank you. I say something back, but then you can come back. So
can you, in your answer, explain a little bit more about what you exactly say?
At the you know how I said Hannah Arendt says we start again and do repeat birth in a way, and then come those Italian feminists and are like, ha, you don't give birth to yourself alone. There's a mother there who does it. And then Luisa Morano has that whole theory of, she calls it a revolution in the symbolic order, where she says all sort of our cognitive dissonances and contradictions will vanish once we understand that we did not wir sind nicht allein auf die Welt gekommen. We didn't bring ourselves into this world, and we didn't teach ourselves to speak. Both those things come from what she calls mother, and she doesn't mean the biological mother necessarily. It's very important. I mean, there are tons of problems with it, but it's not that dumb, you know. Yeah. And if we recognize that and acknowledge it truly, she says, then we will stop having this impoverished idea of emancipation, where we always need to sort of cut cut ourselves loose from this sort of dependence on something outside of us, or perhaps even from our actual mothers. But we become free when we understand that our freedom is a co-creativity with those sources. And of course, what taught us to speak can be the whole of culture and everything we ever encountered, and what brought us into the world. Oh, that's sort of the turn that I then want to take is, of course, not just a person. That's super regressive, and there is a certain kind of, there's a real obsessive fixation on the mother in that Italian work. Though I also think, after like 6,000 years of patriarchy, or however you count, like if one gets too nervous after 1-2 sentences about the power of mother, maybe one has to also stay with it a bit longer. And but the philosophical point I want to take from it has, in a way, almost nothing to do anymore with motherhood, but with this idea that we're kind of brought in the world through those sort of temporal things that come before us, and we need to understand that freedom is sort of cooperation with those forces. And I do see that it's actually really nostalgic, and I am super nostalgic for this Italian feminist, and it's nostalgic and it's bourgeois, and I think, but I wrote it trusting that, like, most people haven't even heard of Luisa Muraro, and she's definitely not gonna now have a huge comeback, so I kind of maybe considered myself too safe, but considered myself quite safe in the kind of fourth wave of queer trans feminism, where, like, this wouldn't get rid of the level we had achieved. But yeah, you might be right that that's a bit of a too big risk.
Laura, it's interesting because we were talking about the book, and you also mentioned. I'm throwing you a little bit into the deep because I think you can start. Wait, what appealed to the? What did you like about the book? I'll give you a little minute to
So I'm one of the lawyers. I'm not a philosopher, but I could of course totally also see this. I find it very intriguing to also read this part, though I felt also that in this part, but I don't know them. This particular philosophy that the father was a bit lacking. My father is in the audience. He's a very important person to me. And so the father of my son is also very, like, I think he would be a mother considered.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say fathers can be mothers too.
Exactly. But then I find the language rather confusing. But what I also totally saw is a feminist element, of course, in the freedom to stay. Also, when you think of divorce, who gets to stay in the home? It's usually, I think, the people, the one with the most money will be the father usually, or the man. But no, I thought it was very intriguing, of course, also for this for all the ecological elements, because I'm very interested in that. And when you were just talking, I really found the passages very beautiful that you just refer to when you discuss, like, how there are more forms of life in a handful of earth, and then there are humans on the world. And you also at some point you mentioned this piece of research that I also often mention to my students, for example, that the man-made materials on the world now weigh more than the natural materials, which is, if you think about it, it's so insane. Yeah. And also because if you think of the earth, it's of course only like this small, there's a very thin layer of crust on top of the planet, right? That makes it livable or habitable for us, and that we transform all that ground into concrete and metal. That's, I think, totally insane. And I'm very interested in the rights of nature itself. That is something that's coming up all over the world, which is really a paradigm shift in the law. Instead of being an object of property, the nature becomes a subject of rights. I actually have so many questions, so I'm about to come to a good point. But one thing that sometimes I see in also the activism around rights of nature is, I'm also is sometimes an all too heavy, perhaps, emphasis on this harmony of nature. And that's where my little bit tiny critical note perhaps comes in, because at some point, and it's this beautiful passage, and I love it. I love the whole book. And then and then you emphasize that we can share our time with other living beings without losing time. And in a time of prosperity, we have more freedom, not simply because there's more, but because everything supports each other. And of course, I agree on especially if you zoom out a bit. But I'm always also a bit skeptical because also in the natural world, it can be so cruel, right? Ant colonies have horrible wars where they slaughter each other, or ant colonies can actually slaughter bees to steal their honey. So I think this, of course, time only exists in space, right? A year is simply a circle around the sun, so it is a space. So, and I don't think we can infinitely share our time. So I was wondering how you see it. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
Can we infinitely share our time?
Well, I think if you're very much in love, or to be even more kitschy than I already was in that passage, but I think infinitely share our time. It's not us who infinitely share our time, but I do think an intact ecosystem is one where, like, whatever your output is can also be used by something else, and the whole thing stays in a relative equilibrium. And that doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of, like, the whole point of it is eating and being eaten. And obviously, human life is much more than that, but it is quite spectacular that we've managed to now sort of have a form of reproducing ourselves in this ecological world where we systematically produce output that isn't just like, I mean, it's lying around and it's heavy, but it's doing more than that. It's really interrupting and destroying a lot of those sort of cycles of regeneration. And the kind of sixth mass extinction is kind of brutal in a kind of degree in which, like, the ant colony would just never be. And so that humans have managed to create those conditions, I think, yeah, that's the scandal of, like, in some sense, infinitely living of the time of other species and future life forces.
I love it that you use the word scandal, because I think there also your normativity, of course, comes in. And I wanted to make a remark, if that's allowed, about because the former speaker said that the rule of law argument is weak, and I would firmly disagree. And I also would disagree with that law and normativity or morality are so different. As you know, as a lawyer, so how I think this is related is that the rule of law gives us the freedom to participate in a democracy in which we together determine what the norm should be. So ideally, those norms should reflect also our morality, of course. And that is also where, even if currently a legal interpretation of, for instance, a human right says that, okay, it's not a human rights violation if someone has to wait at least 1.5 years for that someone even looks at their request for family reunification, because our morality matters to legal interpretation. That interpretation can change over time. So there's a very deep relation there. And I think that the rule of law and democracy allows us to discuss what are the norms. So to discuss this normativity, we need the rule of law, the rechtsstaat. So yeah, that's just a side note, because I'm very passionate about the rechtsstaat.
But what do you think? But there is a real problem of how we bring nature into it, right? And I am actually really skeptical of this idea of according the kind of right status that we now have to natural entities, because by doing so, there are two very odd things. One thing is we treat the kind of foundation of all our lives that we all depend on as if it was, I don't know the English word, like a mundel, like something, like a minor that can't represent themselves in law, but always needs sort of a more grown-up person to represent it, which is a guardian, yes, which is sort of completely turning around the relation. And the second thing is that the rights of nature, they cut out certain entities in this very reifying way, because I think that works for individuals, but it doesn't work for a tree or a forest. Like we have this case in Germany where the environmental movement even won the court case against the the mining company that they should protect the forest, but then they just did the coal mining up to the very side of the forest and pumped out all the water, and the forest died anyway, because that water is of course part of what the forest needs. And if you mess up the climate system so that there is also no rain, then even the groundwater will go by itself. So it's very important not to kind of isolate those things. And that's why I try that this materialism of tides, so this attempt to say everything in nature has a certain time that it takes to regenerate, and we need to somehow learn to be less analphabetic about that and understand what sort of time are we destroying. And it's vastly different the time you destroy when you destroy a species that then also takes some other things with it in the ecosystem than if one ant colony eats the other, or the lice or whatever they eat, because it's kind of, that time can replenish itself. So I think I don't know how that could translate into law. But
that's one of the problems, I think, with rights of nature, because if you take it seriously, of course, and this is also, in fact, interpreted that way by judges in Ecuador, for instance, who also say rights of nature imply rights of an individual, a monkey called Estrellita in that case. But yeah, that is problematic. And for who are those rights? Because if you would say, yeah, well, the Dutch people, due to cholera, they they diminished but over time they restored again, we would feel highly offended, because we think of individual humans as having dignity, individual dignity, and that is, I think, problematic about the whole rights of nature. That. Or at least it doesn't match many of our thinking about nature, as you say it. And if you take it seriously, then indeed an individual tree can have a right. And sometimes people also think about it that way. There was, and when was it, a year ago or so in Scotland, some kind of vandalist? I don't know what's the English word. He cut a tree, and everyone felt like The Economist even contributed an obituary to this tree, right? So it's clearly the individual dignity of that tree. But if we take it seriously that way, then we can't say, okay, we can cut some trees and then it will grow back again. It works very different than with human rights, I think. And it's something that should be thought through more.
Yeah, but this rights of nature movement is, of course, a way or an attempt to integrate this nature into the human system. And if I read you correctly, you are proposing the other way around, right? We need to integrate the human little area into the world.
Yeah, or have a different understanding of what the nature in us and the outer nature is. And all the while, you see, I really don't think that we don't differ in some ways from nature. Like we have those other temporalities, like the finitude and the potential, the spontaneity is something that I don't see in nature. So it's not a sort of post-humanist account. But if you ask what it is for nature to be free, I would say it is to do this regenerative work in sort of uninterrupted tides. Like, that's also the difference between a kind of industry chicken that is kind of fed in a way to like grow as fast as possible, and an animal that can kind of do its species being in the wild or in a kind of less forced environment. I think we can see those distinctions, and they're actually not so different from how sometimes what makes the work into something very tedious is not just the content, it's also just in what can you do it in a certain rhythm? Are you all the time stressed doing it, or kind of pressed into to synchronize with something that totally doesn't fit with you? So in that way, then what would it mean to liberate that? Like, and then I think that's more the right to stay in one's own temporality, rather than the right to just be allowed to exclude that pollutant or something. I mean, my joke about the rights of nature is always that I say, you know, if we gave the rights to the river, then it will finally be possible for the capitalist who built his factory on the river to sue the river when the river flooded the factory. Because, of course, those rights will only be as strong as like whatever group litigates in their name. You know, can the river afford the big lawyer, and how do we do all that? But I mean, everything helps, like, obviously.
No, but it is a bigger question, of course. Like, I think, on the one hand, your proposal of how the world should function.
I'm not sure I have a proposal of how the world should function.
It seems to me, it seems very intuitive. Like, yes, this would make so much more sense than the way we abuse each other and the world right now. But on the other hand, it's quite far away from how the world is right now, and it really is this difference. Like, how do we get there? And I guess this, like, how utopian can you think, and how in what kind of steps should we think of getting there is a question that maybe more people on this table struggle with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think something that I was very interested in is your mentioning of desire as a more politically potent force than power for some of the feminists that you are talking about. Mm-hmm. But then we also know that second wave feminism, right, ultimately accrued a lot of state power, and in doing so lost its radical edge, actually really completely. So in a way it also was its demise, maybe. Right, or like some of its success.
I'm such an anarchist, and yet I sometimes wish they had accrued more state power.
Really?
Well, sorry, carry on.
I mean, I guess that I wanted to ask you to speak to that notion of desire, but then and then also, if we, as the historian that I am, really just connected to what actually happened with some of the theory that you are writing about, right? I mean, if we just move beyond the theory to what actually happened with some of these ideas, right? Is that...
Can you make that more concrete?
Well, for instance, is that women gained a lot of rights. Are we fully emancipated? I would not say so, right? So then what do we do with the sort of legal discussion versus politics versus the rest of it? And I mean, this is a huge question, but I have to throw it out.
Well, I want to hear, of course, what your solution with regard to the nuclear family is. But so maybe one word to the question about desire. I do think it's important in feminist theorizing to have a notion of that, and I find it interesting, the kind of trajectory of that concept, because indeed those Italian feminists were very strong on it, and then it pops up in queer theory, and it's actually not, and queer theory often prioritizes desire before gender identity, but desire. But the link is Teresa de Laurentiis, who was first with the Milano Collective and then fell out with them because they were so homophobic, and then sort of she kind of co-founded queer theory in the US Academy, and that it kind of travels. That's one of the ways that concept travels. Why I'm systematically interested in it is because I think so. The psychoanalytic and feminist accounts of desire would always say, desire, even if we talk on the drive or instinctual level, with humans, it's always mediated. There's always some kind of idea or some fantasy scenario that gives it its shape. And in some sense, I say that the same is true for freedom. Like there is no such thing as negative freedom. That is just the absence of coercion. There's always, even that, what calls itself negative freedom is freedom mediated by the property form, by that fantasy that there is something that in that domain I can do whatever I want, because I kind of quasi own it. And I think we need to desire something else. and sometimes we already do, like we desire to be less stressed and less hostile and things like that. But I do think there's also a combination that desire does translate into power, but it's a kind of more kind of agentive horizontal power. Could be the power of assembly or the type of power that Veronica Gago calls potencia rather than the power over. And so that was the first part of your question, but the second part was much more critical, and I'm to say, yeah, exactly. What has happened with our victories? Well, I think it's important to say that. So, for instance, Nancy Fraser has this point that sort of second wave feminism sort of sold out to neoliberalism, and I do agree that we had a one-sided emancipation of the sphere of wage work and not a liberation of reproductive labor, and that's a huge problem. But this fantasy that feminists did something wrong and that's why neoliberalism came about, it's ridiculous. I mean, there are much other stronger forces that just meant that something sort of turned a certain way, and there was very little that feminists could have done about it. And also some of them kept being very radical. It's just it didn't get any uptake, because the institutional surroundings or something wasn't there. So I also feel it's this weird negative narcissism and always looking at what did the movement I'm in do wrong, rather than trying to be like, wow, what the hell, all those things that happened in the world, and what possibility would there have been? I mean, I don't even know how one assesses that, but I think that's why I'm also maybe a bit less worried to use some of those ideas that also had bizarre tangents, because I'm like, oh, it's a different moment now. Something else will come of it now, or anyway, it's not. There are other material forces that shape the kind of way that the story goes on. They are much more powerful than whatever idea a feminist philosopher plays with. But I do think we are losing on the left at the moment the discourse of sort of drive and desire to the right, and I do think that that's like a very bad road to take, and we need to have something to put against that. Yeah.
So the last question I want to ask before I want to know if there are any other questions in the audience is about this. How do we get to this world where there is perhaps more possibility for everyone to have this Bleibefreiheit? And you propose the general strike, or you float the idea of the general. You toy with the idea of a general strike. So what is appealing to that?
Well, so I also want to say that maybe we don't get to the world we want. And that still doesn't mean that it's not useful to think about what world we would want. It would be really like evacuating also our own inner freedom to not do that. I don't think we here have the basis for anything like a general strike. I use it in that chapter actually more as a kind of extreme point of political mobilization that, as I put it, at the same time stops time, because like everything is still, and gives you the possibility to start anew, because the kind of, if the society really halts, and I'm using the strike against the Kapp-Putsch in the 1920s in Germany, because that was the only one we had, and it was against the fascist coup, and it's not so, like, we're living in times where that doesn't seem like completely abstract option that such a thing could happen. And then the coup did really fail because nothing was, the whole economy really stopped. The press, everything, the electricity didn't work anymore, so they had to give up. And I do find it politically important that we remember that such a way of collective action exists, also because we are in this huge campaign of militarization, where I think it's important to remember that there are other ways to resist even a very violent coup or onslaught than just the kind of military way of fighting. There is a political way of fighting, and the extreme form is general strike. But this is not a kind of what should be done, oh, general strike. We have nothing of the organizational basis for it. I mean, there in that time, it was a matter of the SPD and the KPD agreeing, and it took them 2 days to agree, which was a long, but they had their structures. We don't have any of those structures that could agree to do that. And yet, for instance, in Argentina, we've seen cycles of mobilization where the general strike idea was actually taken on by the feminist movement. But also, I mean, right now, that hasn't stopped Millet, right? And so I think it would be totally spurious to be like, oh, we have to do this and that, and then we get there, you know, we would be there. But I think from the perspective of the concepts that I develop in that book, then we can think of political work as a struggle around time and around reclaiming our time and sort of trying to strike also by sort of withdrawing our time from that which abuses or dominates it. And that's something, I mean, and I think feminism has always been very strong on the insistence that micropolitics are not nothing. And, you know, that it's not like if the weaker we are, the more we have to look for this one great lever and then, wow, everything will change. No, it's not like that. So even if the situation is very bad, there's still some aspects or some contexts in which you can struggle to liberate your time. Also, and I mean, that can be a struggle for labor rights, for shortening labor time. It can be a struggle for healthcare, you know, and for healthier living conditions. It can be a struggle for the time of nature to regenerate itself. It's a sort of, yeah, I guess that's the perspective, but are we going to win? I mean, no, we are losing big time at the moment.
Then I would like to go.
Great, thank you.
Well, it was great spending time with you. Yes. Is there someone in the audience who would like to ask a question? I have 2 here. And there's also a possibility to ask questions to the earlier speakers.
Okay, good. First, thanks for the honor of being the first male to speak tonight.
I didn't notice. Hi.
I have a whole complex of questions, but I'll limit myself to the first level. And that is, when we talk about freedom tonight, that is has all kinds of positive connotations, and that's also in my world. Now, recently I understood that there's a trend among women who do have Bleibefreiheit in the Netherlands to join the Islam. And the interesting thing is that the reasoning that they gave for that is that they wanted away from freedom and they were looking for the structure that it provided them in their lives. Now, with your background, I would be very interested to hear how you would look at that.
Mm-hmm. Should I reply straight away?
Yeah, you can answer.
Yeah, I obviously know nothing about that phenomenon. I know about this very good work by the critical theorist Saba Mahmoud on the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and on the women that join their activism and how it's not as easy as saying you kind of relinquish your freedom to order by joining there, right? I think that might be more of an outsider perspective. So I think that would perhaps be the place that I would look to for an answer, and I think that's all I can say for now. Yeah.
And do we have questions on this side? Walk around. I saw another one there. Yes.
Well, thank you. I have a question that is, on a theoretical level, very abstract, almost almost very Marxist. I'm sorry, but it's also very practical because it relates to Laura's question as well, and also to the question, what should we actually do? Which is, if I think about freedom and nature, I also notice that they're sometimes opposed, right? So one of the, I think, original Marxist questions would be, how can you, as a creature of nature also be free, right? You can't just... And then I noticed this duality in your stance towards the question if we're part of nature or not. So that's the simple question, I guess, because you talk about this harmony in nature, which would imply us being part of nature, but then you also say, well, for us, being free is to be creative, whereas for nature, perhaps, being free is this harmonious part, right? Which would kind of imply a split between us and nature, precisely on the point of freedom. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on the question if we're actually part of nature in terms of freedom.
Maybe I use this microphone because then I can look at you. It's just so odd to answer like that. So I think there is a split in us, not between us and nature, but there's a split in us between different realms of freedom. But unlike Marx and that tradition, I don't think that there is a split between the realm of necessity and the realm of freedom, where nature is the realm of necessity. And I mean, he would have also think, and my metabolism is part of the realm of necessity, and then once it's satisfied, then starts the realm of freedom. And this is very hard to think. I'm not saying that I've solved it, but I really reject that distinction. And I think also a lot of feminists would also reject that distinction. And I think it's also more urgent to do it now, because if you are a proper Marxist, then you really think that there is a resolution, at least to some of our contradictions. Well, in that way, I'm a proper Marxist, that I believe that there is such a thing as unalienated labor. But now, and some Marxists, especially the ones that draw a very strict distinction between the realm of necessity and the realm of freedom, used to have, some of them still do, this fantasy that the freedom will be a freedom from work, where really we have just free time and can idle. And I mean, feminists have always criticized that.
They actually want to work. So
that's of course a very practical illustration for that. But also, we now live in an eco-disastrous world where there will be so much less care work, not just for humans, also for the planet. Like, if your concept of revolution is have lots of idle time, you can really forget it. And I think, fortunately, a proper Marxist concept of revolution is, no, it's unalienated labor. It's labor that is not forced and that is sort of self-motivated in a certain way. And well, you said it was going to be abstract. No, but it's not. It's as concrete as, people actually like gardening, and some gardens, they have more biodiversity and more calories per square meter than A, wild nature, and B, industrial farming. So that's hopeful. So that's how I would think about it.
So I have time for one more question here at the back.
Thank you so much. I'm really intrigued by this. I didn't know about the concept, so I'm really liking this freedom to stay, and also in relation to migrants. I'm just thinking, like devil's advocate a little bit, could the right, could conservatives not claim this to say as a freedom to stay, for things to stay as they are?
Yeah.
And a freedom to say, we don't want gentrification, we want cities to remain the same, we want farmers to remain where they are. And we don't want extra people in the country that we consider full because it would change things, and we don't want that. And so it kind of made me think, is maybe what you're addressing, to what extent are you addressing something about belonging, an issue of belonging, and people feeling that their freedom only makes sense in a context? I think you said something about negative freedom needs a positive arena, something like that. And I really like that, because it perhaps alludes to this idea that you can only be free if you feel you belong to the context in which you stay. And so it's, and I wonder how it fits within the concept that you have been discussing so well. Yeah.
This is a mic question.
So, it's the same thing. Thank you, that's great. And you know what, probably to some extent, I'm conservative. And I think The conservative, if our problem was people saying, oh, I'd rather want things to stay how they are, I'm not sure I want so many new people move here, we would be in so much of a better situation. Then you could just be like, oh, but it has some advantages, and also they really can't stay where they are. Wouldn't you want to be allowed to move somewhere if you couldn't? And then, fine. But what we see is like, we have this fervent racism that dehumanizes, especially Muslims at the moment. Like there's, I think the way that the right politicizes the resistance to change is weaponizing things in a way that makes them really toxic and sort of splitting. And so if you have a concept that is part of a broader progressive agenda that can accommodate some of the nostalgia, I would actually think it's good. And then, of course, I also hope there will be enough, like, cool, more modernists to kind of, have then a fight with me or with people who use the freedom to stay in a kind of too backward-minded way. But I think if you center on the freedom, then I think you've made sure that you've sort of salvaged the most precious thing of modernity, and you will not fall into some dystopia of freezing everything in time. So for me, it's sort of worth that. And there is a lot of mobility that capitalism forces on us, and then put some sort of ideology that, always stay moving and agile, and wow, that's your freedom. And you can, like in your village, you can't be free because, if you're queer, but in this, just go to the city, and then, now you can't afford your rent. Well, have a career, and and then you need to be cool enough. And like, what? I think it's good to be sort of anti that. and that doesn't make you a fascist.
Thank you so much to all my speakers, to Eva especially. I think I forgot in the introduction to mention the Dutch edition by Alfabet uitgevers, translated by Huub Stegeman, De Vrijheid om te blijven, which is of course also applicable here at the bar. Thank you so much, Eva von Redecker.